rosse bandiere, o proletari alla riscossa, bandiera rossa trionferà. Bandiera rossa deve trionfar, bandiera rossa deve trionfar, bandiera rossa deve trionfar, e viva il comunismo e la libertà, va il popolo alla riscossa, bandiera rossa, bandiera rossa.
Roger Silverman, who's my long-time comrade and activist, been an activist in the labour movement since the 1960s, and has written many pamphlets and books about different aspects of the struggle for socialism in Britain and internationally. Roger has just brought out a new pamphlet about labour and the struggle for socialism, dealing with the issues that face labour now in the period following the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. Roger's going to introduce this discussion for about 20 minutes first, and we're very pleased to have comrades Chris Williamson, Tina Werkmann, and Jackie Walker with us, who are also going to contribute around this same issue, and we hope that there'll be a variety of ideas which will give every comrade more insight into the crucial issues facing the labour movement and the working class movement in Britain at the moment. So I'm going to hand over first of all to Roger Silverman.
Right. Hi, comrades. Thank you very much for attending. Right. The recent revelations of the vile behaviour of officials at the Labour headquarters and the news of the continuing systematic purge of loyal Labour activists has outraged thousands of us and confronted us with the stark decision whether or not the time has come once and for all to abandon the Labour Party as a lost cause. We have to hold these bureaucrats personally and criminally responsible for Labour's failure to form a government in 2017, when just, I think it was 2,027 extra votes in strategically placed constituencies could have put Jeremy Corbyn in Downing Street. What disgusts us all more is that while these treacherous parasites who are making overt racist slurs and sneers remain in place, and while the only inquiry that has been launched is into how these dirty secrets ever came to light, lifelong socialist campaigners against racism are still being summarily kicked out on bogus, trumped-up charges of racism, of anti-Semitism. I was prompted to write this pamphlet, not as a scholastic exercise, but because it offers an urgent and compelling basis on which to make a considered judgment. I hope everyone facing that dilemma right now will read it, not because it's the last word, but because when thousands are agonizing over whether or not to remain members, they should at least take the trouble to put their decision into its proper historical context, rather than act on impulse and just simply flounce out of pique, despair, or an emotional spasm. It's all the more necessary to set the record straight, because a new book currently making the rounds, in my opinion, only confuses and muddles the true history. I deliberately avoided naming the book or directly polemicizing with the author, because I accept that it was written in good faith, and the last thing that is needed right now is a public squabble between fellow socialists on the left of the Labour Party. But I have to say that I find even the very title of the book is misleading and wrong about the most crucial point. For 3/4 of a century, Labour was a socialist party, and without an understanding of that and of how that changed, it's impossible to understand what is happening now. The Labour Party, of course, was not initially an explicitly socialist party. It was just the political voice of the trade unions. But even before it transformed itself into a consciously socialist party, no less an authority than Lenin recommended its admission to the Socialist International on the grounds that The Labour Party may not recognise the class struggle, but the class struggle will inevitably recognise the Labour Party. And so it proved. Under the direct impact of the Russian Revolution and the wave of revolution sweeping Europe, it adopted Clause 4. Now, stripped of its flowery language, and I must say I, for one, rather like its language, it calls for nationalisation of workers' management and control. It calls for an end to capitalism and the establishment of a socialist society. It's true that always remained as nothing more than mere words on paper. Why was it that that programme was never pursued? Even the 1945 to 51 Labour government, which was swept to power by a wave of radicalised workers and soldiers at a time when the ruling class was disarmed and helpless, that government, which did nationalise whole swathes of the economy and establish the National Health Service, securing mass support for generations to follow, even that government shrank from a full socialist programme. For the bureaucrats at the top, of course, Clause 4 was always a source of embarrassment. And why is that? There's no secret about the answer. You can hear it still repeated every year by thousands of mass delegates at Labour Party conferences and mumbled with a transparent distaste and embarrassment even by party leaders, though cowards flinch and traitors sneer. In the words of the red flag, it was the cowardice and treachery of the leadership which every time led to betrayal and defeat. But Clause 4 defined Labour's goal as far as the rank and file were concerned. It was printed on every membership card. The movement held onto it through thick and thin for most of its history, for 3/4 of a century. When Gaitskell, a forerunner of Blair, proposed its replacement in 1959, the same year, by the way, that Macmillan won the third Tory election victory in a row on the slogan, "You've never had it so good." When Gaitskell tried to replace Clause 4, Bevan and the leaders of the left were quite prepared to let it go. For them, as I'm afraid also for the author of the book that I just referred to, Clause 4 was a mere token trinket. But for the rank and file, it was something very different. It was crucial. It was a precious gain to be defended to the death. There was a storm of protests from local parties and trade union branches, and as a result, Gaitskell's proposal was swept into the dustbin. A stark reminder from the rank and file that never mind the traitors and the cowards, we'll keep the red flag flying here. Class-conscious workers understood that, and the ruling class quite definitely understood it. For them, apart from in 1945, when, as I said, it was paralysed by the wave of revolutionary spirit and feeling sweeping the country, no matter how treacherous and cowardly the leaders, Labour governments were tolerated only briefly and under the most extreme pressure. If you read my pamphlets, I do give a detailed history of each of the stages of the history of the Labour Party, and in particular, the experience of successive Labour governments. The 1923 government, minority government, was brought down within months by MI5's Zinoviev letter plot. The 1929 government was brought down within 2 years by bribery and blackmail and the defection of Ramsay MacDonald, who was promptly expelled from the Labour Party. The Wilson and Callaghan governments in the 1960s and the 1970s were also ended in dirty tricks from MI5, bribery, blackmail, defections, and, by the way, very real coup plots. There were overt threats of military coups, military exercises in the 70s in Heathrow Airport, and the serious journals of the ruling class were quoting, in the case of the Wilson government of the 60s, the 67 military coup in Greece, and in the 70s, the 73 military coup in Chile. And they were taking that as blueprints of what could be done if the occasion arose. So what was it that changed in 1994 with the birth of New Labour? New Labour was only possible after a whole succession of defeats: the crushing of the miners, the strangulation of the trade unions, the eclipse of Britain's industrial communities, 4 successive election defeats, the fall of the USSR, which was the last bureaucratic stylist vestige of the October Revolution. Only after all of these setbacks and retreats did Blair succeed in emasculating the party programme and removing even any nominal socialist aspiration. But why did he bother? Why was that so important for Blair? If it was really just a mere trinket, why remove it? And obviously it was done as a demonstration and a reassurance to the ruling class. This is not old Labour. This is not the Labour Party that you knew before. This is New Labour. New Labour represented something very different from what had gone before. It scrapped Labour's socialist constitution. It stripped any vestiges of democratic control by the party conference. It emasculated the National Executive Committee. It replaced the largely corrupted former trade unionists who then made up the composition of the Parliamentary Labour Party with a new generation of smooth PR lobbyists and political advisors. It publicly boasted that they were supremely relaxed about the filthy rich. All the billionaires' company funds that used to float into Tory coffers were now flooding into New Labour. Rupert Murdoch, who had previously crowed in 1992, it was the Sun what won it for the Tories, he was now banging the drum for Blair and New Labour. And that support by the ruling class, overt and transparent support by the ruling class, in complete contrast with any previous Labour governments, that lasted right up to the time of the 2008 crash, when suddenly New Labour had outlived its usefulness and they switched support to a renovated Tory party. Again, if you want more information on that, please read my pamphlet, which gives the history in more detail. Now, that New Labour era also is dead and buried. It's Blairism that is dead and discredited today. 500,000 people surged into the Labour Party, inspired by the leadership of Corbyn. Corbyn won 2 successive leadership elections by overwhelming landslide victories. Actually, in 2017, if you discount the case of Scotland, which was lost due to decades of corruption by the right wing, in the election in 2017, Corbyn actually won more votes than Blair's record in 1997. And this time, in stark contrast to 97, it was in the teeth, of course, of ferocious opposition from the ruling class. Even in 2019, by the way, which is completely lyingly dismissed by the bourgeois papers as the worst result since 1935. Actually, Corbyn in 2019, and it was a bad result, it was a disappointing result, but even in 2019, Labour won more votes than Blair won in 2005 when he won. So what now? Starmer obviously is the choice of the ruling class for Labour leader, and under his leadership, the traitors, such as those that we talked about already, the traitors in the Labour Party headquarters, are protected, and there's a ruthless purge continuing at breakneck speed of loyal socialists out of the party. Of course, a wave of disappointment and despair is natural, but how successful really can the right wing be in these conditions? 135,000 members still in the recent leadership election still voted for the Corbyn legacy. And I believe many of the people who voted for Starmer too were thinking perhaps that he was a more competent and credible leader than the left candidate, and deluded particularly by his cynical promise when he said, completely untruthfully, that he was pledged to continue the radical tradition of Jeremy Corbyn. I think many of them also did not know what they were voting for and what they've ended up with. I don't blame comrades for their anger and their revulsion at the antics of the temporarily resurgent right wing. But anger is not enough. What's needed is some strategic vision and perspective. And let's remind ourselves, today is not 1997. Look at the world today. Even before the onset of the pandemic or the lockdown, we had the most violent and tortuous political convulsions. We had a looming recession worse than that of 2008. Uprisings in countries on 4 continents, at least 35 countries, where thousands of people, tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, braving tear gas and police bullets, and in many cases succeeding in overthrowing governments in Latin America, in North Africa, in Asia. Millions now today, even today now, with all the restrictions of the lockdown, we're seeing mass mobilizations on the streets. We're seeing, of all things, millions on the march in America. Suddenly, by the way, America is apparently now the center of the world revolution. The youth everywhere, throughout the globe, everywhere the youth is on the march for justice, against racism, for jobs, for the salvation of the planet. And on top of this, we're facing the certain prospect of the worst slump, not since the 1930s, but now all the serious quality financial columns are saying the worst slump for over 300 years. I think 1709 is the reference point. So we are, to use the name of our journal, on the brink. We really are on the brink of a completely new era in world history, perhaps a little bit over the brink. So are these the conditions for the return of a kind of middle way, third way, social democratic, new Labour programme? However much Keir Starmer may want it, how stable or enduring can a Blairite policy continue or be maintained in these conditions? It's one way or the other. It's either a turn to a radical socialist program, or otherwise it means complete capitulation. And in the event of complete capitulation, what is going to happen to the apparent support that the right wings seem to have temporarily and very, very precariously at the present time? So after, true, we had some unexpected victories, but now we've had a setback, but that's all. Now, we're not saying simply lamely stay and fight, because what does that mean? We're not talking about just keeping our membership cards going, passing resolutions which will end up in the bin anyway, soldiering on in the hope of eventually maybe electing a new Corbyn, only then to see him or her too brought down by a conspiracy of the ruling class of the party bureaucracy. I quite agree, that's not the alternative. But what is fatal, and I hope that everybody would agree, what would be really fatal is for the thousands or tens of thousands of party activists to just simply drop out in dribs and drabs in their 2s and 3s and just go home. If the left don't reclaim the party, then it's just going to be moribund and it's going to rot. And the time may come at a certain time to abandon it and start afresh. But that must not be in 1s and 2s, but in our 10s and hundreds of thousands. It's got to be a real mass mobilization. In other words, it's not a question of dropping out, but of marching out. And we march out only when we know where we're going and when we know we can count on mass support. The first objective is therefore to reclaim the Labour Party for the working class. The key to that is the trade unions. The trade unions founded the Labour Party. They funded it for a century. In the new Labour years, it's true, the lavish funding came from big business. But now, once again, Labour relies on trade union funding, largely and mostly. The trade union bureaucracy, we know, it's massive, elephantine, largely corrupt. It's as slow to shift as a tanker. My favourite cartoonist from the 1930s, David Lowe, always represented it as a cart horse. But in the catastrophic situation ahead, even the trade union bureaucracy can't fail to respond, no doubt, treacherously, clumsily, ponderously, grudgingly, but it can't fail in one way, just for their sheer self-survival, to respond to its members' needs. Trade union membership is now, by the way, at last shooting up again. During the course of the pandemic, there's been a huge increase in trade union membership. Maybe some comrades can confirm that with the figures. And in addition to that, of course, new unions have been springing up in the recent period to articulate the needs the new composition of the working class, the needs of the new precariat. Remember also, in 2004, both the RNT and the FBU disaffiliated from the Labour Party. They left the Labour Party. The RNT has still not rejoined. Never mind going back that far, but in as recently as 2015, just before the election of Corbyn, Len McCluskey of Unite threatened to disaffiliate from the Labour Party and to form a new party, a workers' party. Together with the 500,000 individual members, overwhelmingly left, who flocked to the banner of Labour once Corbyn had gained the leadership, and they left and they joined, aspiring to a socialist rebirth of Labour. If you take that together, we have potentially an absolutely formidable force. All that the right wing have is just the hypocritical, treacherous, and very transitory support, secondary support of the ruling class. Remember, this is the main point, and I'm finishing on this point. The Labour Party is not one party. It's two absolutely diametrically opposed, hostile parties. New Labour and its successors are simply puppets of the ruling class. And moreover, by the way, no longer even puppets, but just the abandoned rag dolls of the ruling class. The anomaly in the Labour Party can only be resolved by a parting of the ways. I'm talking, let's put it plainly, a split in the Labour Party. It's the only way that this anomaly can be resolved. It's long overdue. And what I would finally end by saying, I'm glad to see that we have comrades here from the LNA, well, I don't know if we've got all here, but I mean, I would say to all the currents in the Labour Party, the LRC, the LNA, Don't Leave Organised, the JVL, and even if it's still salvageable, which is questionable, but even perhaps momentum, all these left currents need to come together under a common umbrella. I'm not talking about fusion necessarily, but a federation. And I would suggest it comes under the umbrella of, under the name Reclaim. Turn to the trade unions and the constituency parties. It's time to reclaim the party, lock, stock and barrel. I thank you very much for listening to me. I'll be very interested to hear what other comrades have to say. And I'll finish on that note. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger, for a very well informed and inspiring introduction to this meeting. I'm now going to call Comrade Chris Williamson, who I'm sure he doesn't need any introduction, was made a heroic stand against the hypocrisy of the accusations that Labour was anti-Semitic during the Corbyn period. And I'd like to invite Chris to address the meeting.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Yeah, I wasn't sure if I was still muted. You know, thanks very much indeed. And thanks for that introduction, Roger. And thanks for letting me have sight of the leaflet. It's a very interesting read and catalogues much of the party's history. Where I think I part company with you is in your closing remarks about reclaiming the Labour Party. I don't think we can reclaim it because we've never owned it in the first place. In my opinion, certainly in the entirety of my membership of the Labour Party from 1976, but I think it goes back much further than that, the Labour Party and the Parliamentary Labour Party has always been out of touch really with the wider membership, the grassroots members, and you've made that very clear, I think, in your opening remarks. But the truth is that the party is controlled by the triumvirate of the Parliamentary Labour Party, which is completely out of control, the National Executive Committee, which is very undemocratic in that only 25% of the members on the NEC are elected by the grassroots membership. The rest are appointed by trade union bureaucrats, the leader of the party, the leader of the parties in Scotland and Wales, the local government representatives and socialist societies. There's not any real kind of election. I think if you spoke to most trade unions members who have representatives sitting on the National Executive Committee, if you asked them who their reps were sitting on the Labour NEC, they'd have absolutely no clue. They're never asked. They're simply put there, grace and favour of the General Secretary. And if we're fortunate to have somebody who's on the left and they put their people in, then we may win a few votes. But by and large, the trade union bureaucracy has been overwhelmingly right-wing, and very often the trade union reps sitting on the National Executive Committee have voted against the interests of their own members. And then, of course, the third leg of the triumvirate is the bureaucracy. And we know from the leaked report that you referred to in your opening remarks, Roger, that they are utterly corrupt and broken. And some of the appalling dirty tricks that they got up to, the out-and-out sabotage of the election in 2017, the attacks that they waged against the grassroots members, against people who supported Jeremy Corbyn, from people like Jackie Walker, who's on this webinar this evening, and obviously myself and Ken Livingston and Mark Wadsworth. These are people who were Jeremy's Praetorian Guard, who were thrown under the bus in a systematic industrial fashion, and it's still happening. I mean, if anything, the purge has increased since Sir Keir Starmer has been elevated to the leadership of the party. But if you look back over the history of the party, and you know, as I said, I've only been a member since 1976. I mean, it's kind of is, or was anyway, 44 years. But you know, right back from the year I joined the party with Dennis Healey going to the International Monetary Fund on the false pretext that Britain was running out of money. How on earth a country like Britain with its own sovereign currency can run out of money, of course, is another question. But that was done in the teeth of the opposition of the grassroots membership, but they paid no heed to it. And then we move on a few years further forward to the so-called winter of discontent. This was Jim Callaghan and the Labour Parliamentary Labour Party, the cabinet, sticking their heels in, being bloody-minded, and not reaching an amicable agreement with the trade union movement, who were understandably concerned about the low pay that many of the members were in receipt of, and they wanted a better deal. And Callaghan, who was supposed to be the leader of the Labour movement, of course, refused to make that agreement, and that played a big part, I think, in us losing the subsequent election in 1979. That was a seminal election, of course, to lose. And then you go forward a little bit further to 1981, and Tony Benn. There was overwhelming support for Tony Benn to become the deputy leader of the Labour Party. He nearly made it, but I think he lost by less than 1%. But again, he lost on the strength of the people that kind of control the Labour Party. Again, the grassroots members, if it had been left to the grassroots members, then of course the Labour Party would have taken a left turn. And then we go a bit further forward to the miners' strike. And I see John Dunn is on this evening, who may speak a bit about that. But Kinnock was absolutely appalling. I mean, the Parliamentary Labour Party, I mean, there were some notable exceptions, of course. Dennis Skinner and Tony Benn and others who were outstanding in their support and the solidarity that they showed to the miners. But the Labour Party didn't cover itself in any glory at that time. And go a bit further forward to Wapping, and then Kinnock getting rid of mandatory selection, and then Blair coming in and scrapping Clause 4. And I think if you spoke to most grassroots members, they wouldn't have wanted that to happen. And then we had the New Labour era. Again, all these policies that were handed down from the party, which was supposed to be the People's Party, the Workers' Party, and they were introducing and expanding things like the Private Finance Initiative against the wishes of the grassroots members. They wanted a totally different approach to the PFI, but the PFI was the only show in town, and it was basically take it or leave it. And so local authorities and other public institutions, the only means of investing in improving public services was through the PFI. And then they introduced, of course, tuition fees and the academisation of schools, and they further deregulated the financial services industry. They did nothing to regulate the private rented sector. They built very few council houses. In fact, Thatcher built more council houses and John Major built more council houses every year than the Labour Party did, or so-called Labour Party under New Labour, in those 13 years. And then we saw no industrial strategy. We saw jobs being offshored to low-wage economies. And then the most-heinous crimes, of course, of all, was the Iraq War. I mean, not only was virtually every single member of the Labour Party against that, virtually large majority anyway of the wider general public, and certainly the overwhelming majority of Labour supporters, were totally opposed to that, but they paid no attention to it. And then we move further forward again to Miliband and Balls, and what a balls up that was. I mean, Ed Miliband talked about turning the page on New Labour. He didn't turn the page on New Labour. It was just a continuation of New Labour. Ed Balls essentially was offering austerity light. And no wonder we struggled to make much headway in that election in 2015. And of course, Jeremy was an incredible breath of fresh air. And at long last, I think many of us felt that we have a genuine socialist at the head of the Labour Party, somebody who will, if we can get Labour into government with somebody like Jeremy Corbyn as the Prime Minister, we might very well then be able to bring about a transformational Labour government that will bring about an irreversible shift in the balance of wealth and power in this country. And of course, introduce a genuine ethical foreign policy, because Jeremy was somebody who spent his entire life as an anti-imperialist, fighting racism, fighting imperialism. And of course, these things were completely unconscionable to the overwhelming majority of the Parliamentary Labour Party. And even though it became the biggest left of centre political party in Europe, I think may have even been the biggest party of all political parties across Western Europe, the overwhelming majority of members wanted to see this modest socialist programme. It wasn't a particularly radical socialist programme when you actually examine it, but it was radical in British terms, I guess. The vast majority of people wanted it. The overwhelming majority of the members wanted it. We know that the vast majority of members supported Jeremy as the leader. They overwhelmingly voted for him in 2015. And then when the coup happened, they overwhelmingly voted for him again with an even bigger margin. But none of that was good enough. We got the biggest increase in vote share, as we'll know, since 1945 in the 2017 election, which was sabotaged by the bureaucracy of the party and the Parliamentary Labour Party of the party and certain figures on the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party. But despite all those achievements, biggest party in Europe, biggest increase in vote share since 1945, a programme that was overwhelmingly supported by the vast majority of the British people, a programme that would have made a huge difference to the quality of life of people in this country. That triumvirate, the Parliamentary Labour Party, the bureaucracy and a section of the National Executive Committee made it their business to ensure that that could not be put into practice. They made sure that we lost the election in 2017 by a tiny margin. We could have gone on and if we'd have got behind Jeremy Corbyn at that point in time, we could have gone on, in my opinion, and won the next election. But we spent the next, 2 years or so, we'd already seen it prior to 2017, systematically undermining Jeremy Corbyn, systematically attacking people who supported Jeremy Corbyn, particularly prominent members of the party who supported Jeremy Corbyn. And we all know what the outcome of that was. People like me were suspended. I eventually resigned from the party. We saw people like Jackie being expelled, Mark Wadsworth being expelled, Tony Greenstein being expelled. Many left-wing, anti-Zionist, socialist Jewish members of our party are being targeted, have been targeted, and have been kicked out. And now they're being, they were kicked out for allegedly bringing the party into disrepute. Now the argument is, as a result of the rule changes at the conference, they're out now accusing people of being racists. People who spent their life fighting racism. This is the Labour Party of today, and it's getting worse. It's intensifying. A few days after the lockdown was announced, I was contacted by several people. I've been contacted now since the lockdown by about a dozen people who've been kicked out of the party, or suspended anyway, for the heinous crime of actually saying something positive about me personally. I mean, this is absurd. And we know where Keir Starmer is going to take the party. He's seen as a safe pair of hands by the establishment. They're getting lots of positive strokes. And we know that he's in bed with the Murdoch empire. We know that he's a member of this very shady organisation, the Trilateral Commission, that was set up, and I think in 1973 by individuals who felt that there was a excess of democracy in the 1960s, and they wanted to have a counterweight to that. The sort of other people who are involved in this shady organisation, the Trilateral Commission, are people like Henry Kissinger, for God's sake. And Keir Starmer is the only serving parliamentarian who's a member of this shady body. Certainly, I don't think there's ever been a leader of the party a member of this. Even Tony Blair, I think, was a member of this outfit. So I just don't think there's any future for the Labour Party. And it really grieves me to say that, because I've spent my life fighting for the Labour Party. I was dedicated to the Labour Party, worked night and day for the Labour Party from first joining it in 1976. And, Roger in his opening remarks said that, there may come a time when, we need to leave and we need to march out in unison. Well, I think, frankly, that time is now. If not now, when? And I think the alternative needs to be, for those of us on the left, is to kind of help to build a grassroots movement that will take on the vested interests, that will take on the powers that be in the establishment. And we're seeing this kind of organic outpouring of anger and mobilization within the Black Lives Matter campaigns and rallies that we've seen up and down the country. And that fills me with a lot of hope, because it's very clear that although the Tories won the last election, that there is hope, that certainly amongst many of the people in the younger generation, that they're not prepared to tolerate this anymore. But if we put all our eggs in the Labour Party basket, I just don't think we're going to get anywhere. And I think that we need to seize this moment. This is a moment in time. This is a moment like, 1968, where there's real anger in this country, in the United States, and in many countries around the world. And we need to be uniting with those progressive movements and liberation struggles. And we need to try and mobilize and coordinate this anger to build a radical grassroots movement that will fight to change this country. And I think at the moment, the kind of electoral route to socialism is absolutely closed off to us. And we therefore need to build the movement so that we can bring through new, energized working class leaders who will be able to put themselves up for election. And there may be a need for a alternative political party, because frankly, I think it's impossible to take control of the Labour Party. And I think that our best effort, therefore, our best hope, therefore, is for us to build a grassroots movement, to coordinate and organise that, and to make sure that we can bring about some of the things which are possible to be achieved outside of the kind of party political structures, through, like a worker cooperative, for example, financial institutions like credit unions and so on, community arts projects. But the most important thing is coordinating the raising of political consciousness and raising people's expectations, because this is an incredibly wealthy country, the 5th biggest economy in the world. And yet we have 14 million people living in poverty. Clearly, representative democracy, and the Labour Party must fall into this category, has comprehensively failed when you consider the fact that this is an incredibly wealthy country and there are so many people in poverty, so many people having to sleep rough on the streets, and inequality is at a level not seen for well over a century in this country. And as I say, I think our best effort needs to be outside the party, because I think if we put our energies into trying to rescue the Labour Party, we'll get nowhere. People will be incredibly frustrated by that. It won't reach out to the kind of wave of anger that is out there, because people are just angry with the whole political class, if you like. And the Labour Party must absolutely fall into that. So I think we need to build something new, something better, something that can really deliver the change that I think all of us on this webinar this evening want to see.
Thank you very much, Chris, for a very clearly stated position. You've set the ground for an excellent debate. I'm now going to call in Tina Werkmann from the Labour Left Alliance.
Hey, comrades. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Yes, I'm also from Labour Against the Witch Hunt, which is where I spent many hours on platforms with Chris and Jackie and others fighting against the witch hunt. I want to disagree both with Chris and Roger on quite a few things, although of course I agree with the majority of what both have said. The witch hunt, obviously I agree with comrades on, and I think we also need to say right at the beginning that we've suffered a huge defeat with Corbyn's defeat. It's a huge defeat for the left. We had such an opportunity to really change not just the Labour Party, but society, and we've blown it. And I think much of it was self-inflicted, a self-inflicted defeat, by choosing from day one to appease the right rather than trying to stand up to it, at least trying to stand up to it. I think Corbyn and his allies have really thrown the towel in. They haven't even tried to take them on. And of course, what happened in the process is comrades like Chris, Jackie, myself, and hundreds and others have been thrown to the wolves in the hope of calming the right and the hope of calming them down and to finally shut up. Maybe the next victim will, the next step back will shut them up, etc. Of course, it didn't. You give a little bit of blood to the right, they smell it, and they become emboldened, they become stronger, and they demanded more and more, and they still do. It's still going on. That's the worrying thing. Well, not the worrying thing. It's a very interesting thing. It's still going on, and I get back to it because it started about Corbyn, but it's going much further. I think there's a much bigger agenda going on there to spread the witch hunt into wider society. Corbyn, in my view, and we've in Labour Against the Witch Hunt and other groups, we've pressed and pressed. He should have done what Blair did when he came in. Blair came in, and he remade the Labour Party as he saw fit, and he done away with the Labour Party conference making any political decisions. He outsourced it properly to the National Policy Forum. He abolished Clause 4, but I'll get back to that as well. I don't think it's a particularly socialist Clause 4, but we'll get back to that. And he remade the Labour Party, but Corbyn did none of it. Yes, he was surprised. It was a surprise victory, but we could have done much more. Even when the members fought for democratic change and came so close to mandatory reselection at the Labour Party conference 2018, Corbyn said nothing. And I kind of think Ben McCluskey probably was right when he says Corbyn asked him to vote against it because he was not up to it. He did not want to put off the right. So I think we need to really learn from this, from these self-inflicted defeats of our forces. The left has been terrible the last 5 years, the organised left, not just Momentum, but also those who are uncritically supporting Corbyn. I think that was wrong. So I think it's still ongoing, and what I am witnessing in law and the LLA, working in law and the LLA, is a self-censorship is spreading in the Labour Party and beyond, not just on Palestine Zionism and opposing Zionism openly, but also to challenging the witch hunt and standing with expelled members. Note Diane Abbott and Belle Ribeiro apologising for being in the same meeting as Jackie Walker and Tony Greenstein. The Stop the War Coalition has just put out a really weird statement, proudly claiming that it has never invited Tony Greenstein to any of its platforms without being asked the question. We have the left really self-censoring at the moment. I'm also a bit worried about hearing that comrades are launching yet another initiative of the left, all in the name of left unity. Now the next one is called Reclaim, you say. And we're splitting into smaller and smaller groups, all in the name of left unity. I'm really worried about that. The Labour Left Alliance was set up about a year ago, and it is open for left groups to affiliate and to participate openly in its decision making. And I hope comrades consider doing that rather than setting up something else. I think don't leave organised. I think it was wrong to set up another group which is pretty similar actually to the Labour Left Alliance, and I think that's a real shame. So I urge comrades to consider joining the Labour Left Alliance. I want to take up Roger's key argument, which I think is from his book, which I disagree with, is that for 75 years the Labour Party was socialist. And I'm much more with Simon Hanna's book title. It was a party with socialists in it, and that's always been the case, and I think that is correct. But I don't believe the Labour Party was ever ours. It was never socialist. If you say, and I think I got that from your introduction, that it was socialist because it had Clause 4. I think we need to take a closer look at Clause 4 and why it was introduced and by who. And it was a reflection, of course, of the heightened class struggle in 1918. And it was an attempt actually by Sidney Webb, not a Marxist, not even much of a socialist. It's a pacifist, a believer in eugenics. The Fabian Society is not a very left-wing organization, is it? And it wasn't then either. So it was an attempt to channel the revolutionism from the Russian Revolution into safe channels. And that's what they did with Clause 4. Clause 4 is all about distribution. It's about nationalization of production and distribution of the fruits of labor, etc., etc. It's not about socialism in the Marxist sense of the word, or taking over society, the working class running society for itself and by itself. It's more about, you know, the state doing it on behalf of the working class, perhaps a left-wing state. And I think I differ much with you on your definition on what socialism is. Jeremy Corbyn, could he have installed a socialist government? Lots of people on the left were talking about that. You know, Jeremy Corbyn gets into government and then installs a socialist government. I profoundly disagree. It's very important that we're clear what socialism is. It's the conscious rule of the working class, not, you know, a minority. And, you know, if Jeremy Corbyn had won the elections, imagine the PLP, the majority was against him. The media, the entire media was against him. The hostility from both his inside the party and outside, he would have no chance of running a government that could actually be capable of even taking the tiniest steps towards socialism in the real sense of the word. So much worse, of course, was the working class struggle when Corbyn came into power. Trade union struggles was at absolute low. The working class at the moment is not in the position, actually, to fight for socialism. So should we say Jeremy Corbyn could have led a socialist government? I think that's seriously misleading about what socialism is. It needs the majority of the working class to consciously fight for it and consciously fight to overturn and, you know, get rid of capitalism. And not talking about, you know, nationalizations, etc. That's not socialism. Can the Labour Party ever introduce socialism? And that's a really interesting discussion, actually, we've been having in the Labour Left Alliance in our weekly webinars. And it's very dubious, isn't it? The Labour Party, can socialism be introduced through Parliament? Of course it can't, as Chris said. The Labour Party, however, can be an important arena of the class struggle. And I think we've seen that over the last 5 years, where the right and the left, I mean, we've had some vicious fights. You know, it wasn't just about the Labour Party. This was about the class struggle in wider society, which is why the right put in everything they had and used everything at their disposal to pour into the Labour Party. And so it is a very important arena of the class struggle. The Labour Party, the working class in Britain, because of the very undemocratic first past the post system, mainly, chiefly, the working class sees the Labour Party as theirs at the moment because it's such a low ebb, etc. As long as that is the case, I think we need to have a strategic approach to the Labour Party, which means also, if we can, get involved in it, keep our membership cards if we can. Lots of people can't anymore. Lots of people have been slandered, you know, have been viciously attacked, etc., and they can't stomach it anymore. I totally understand that. Many people have left now with Starmer's election. I urge them not to, but I do understand why they're doing it. And both the Labour Left Alliance and Labour Against the Witch Hunt accept members who have left the Labour Party, although we urge them not to do it. But this is, I think, what we need. We need a strategic approach to change, you know, to fight the class war in the Labour Party. But we also, I totally agree with Chris, socialism cannot come through the Labour Party and cannot be introduced by an act of Parliament. That is not socialism. So we need to fight outside and inside the Labour Party. I think we need both sides of the struggle. The point, though, for me is, if we do stay in the Labour Party now, we really have to have a really conscious and thorough discussion. Why are we staying and what for? And I don't see the Labour left doing that. I see a lot of Labour lefties now saying, oh, what we need to do now is now get the Socialist Campaign Group on board because, you know, they've been so great the last 5 years, have they, you know? Why, you know, do we need to subordinate ourselves to them? Why should we accept that Jackie Walker, Tony Greenstein, Chris Williamson can't speak on our platforms because they're demanding that now? They will not speak on platforms with expelled members. Why should we accept that? We don't. You know, we have to fight. If we stay in the Labour Party, we have to fight openly, and it's going to be a really vicious fight. And we have to be prepared to be expelled, and we have to be prepared to be suspended, etc. But unless we do that, I see very little point in staying in the Labour Party, you know, to just keep our head down and hope for what? We've had a huge chance, the left had a huge chance, and it squandered it massively because it wouldn't stand up and wouldn't openly fight for what is necessary. And that includes, you know, fighting for what really is socialism. And I think, you know, we should do it inside the Labour Party. We should fight against the ban of Marxist socialists to join the Labour Party and organize within the Labour Party. It's part of the witch hunt against the left. Lots have been expelled for that reason, you know, the auto expulsions for supporting Marxists, etc. And I think unless we do that, you know, I see little point in staying in the Labour Party. And that, I think, will be the left in the Labour Party is now changing. It is discussing where it's going, and I think it's actually breaking up into smaller groups because not everybody is prepared to stand up and fight. But unless we do that now, I see very little point in staying. So I'm hoping comrades will join us in the Labour Left Alliance to fight that fight openly, but also, you know, we will get engaged with Chris Williamson's initiative, etc. But I see very little point building more sort of inside the Labour Party, like a reclaim thing, DLO, you know, it's all in the name of unity. We're all splitting up into ever smaller forces, and I see that as a real worry there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tina, for a really well presented argument. I'm now going to go on to call Jackie Walker into the discussion. After Jackie's spoken, I'll be taking debate, and please put your hand up electronically so that I can see if you want to come into the discussion. I've already got one customer waiting in the queue. Okay, so it's Jackie, welcome to the meeting.
I've got a terrible signal, and so what I'd really like to do is to just speak quite briefly, because I think it's going to be a bit tenuous. And I think, in any case, I think, you know, I don't feel my expertise is particularly the Labour Party, and it would be great if my signal does start breaking up too much, if you would call Graham to fill in some bits. I have to say, I agree with all sorts of things that have already been said by all the speakers, and I'm not going to repeat what people have been saying. And so I'm just going to pick up a few points. One is, I think it's really clear where Starmer is going. Everything he's doing is speaking to the establishment. Everything he's doing, for example, when he took the knee, you know, that awful photo of him taking the knee, when he was talking about the legacy of Bernie Grant and Diane Abbott, given the awful way with which he responded to black MPs, both with the leaked report and with the issue with Bell and Diane actually daring to be at a meeting with expelled members, shows how he feels about black members. But and black members, I have to tell you, are in uproar about this. And he's not speaking to them. He's speaking to his constituency. And his constituency, by the way, are not the left members of the Labour Party at all. He doesn't really care very much about them. That's why he's in the Telegraph and in the Times all the times, and the Times regularly. He is speaking to his constituency, and therefore what he is attempting to do is to go back. He's talking about reclaiming. He's reclaiming Blairism, and that is going to be his project. And I have absolutely no doubt about that. And yes, the witch hunt is getting worse. It's affecting, certainly again, me yet again, with more twisting and more smearings of something that I posted. And what you see there, and this is a concern, what you see now, and this links with something that Tina was saying, is the left itself, sections of the left itself, joining in with how momentum has been to actually become the witch hunters. So we see factions of the left actually eating itself without being able to see in any way where this will end up, because it will end up with them being actually annihilated. Now, where do I see the signs of hope? Well, like Chris and like Roger, you know, my heart is uplifted by what's happening with Black Lives Matter. I was at a Black Lives Matter march yesterday in Thanet. Anybody who knows Thanet will understand, predominantly white. You know, we had the only UKIP council in the whole country. And this was the second Black Lives Matter march. There was one last weekend. There was between 1,000 and 2,000 people there. It was extraordinary. But what was also very pointed about this is that there was absolutely no sign of what you would call the Labour movement. That doesn't mean there weren't some left Labour members there. There were, but there were no trades union banners. There was no official Labour members representation at all. It is absent from there. That's very interesting. And not only that, but I've just, in fact, recently I'm being told that that is not just coincidence. It's because from Labour MPs to Labour councillors are being forbidden to become involved in it. So we're going to start seeing something very interesting happening, where you have this, what appears to be a sustaining action on the street, which at the moment is not in any way embedded in what we understand to be the Labour movement. You could say, you know, you can understand why that might happen in terms of Starmer's Labour Party, but the fact that there is no union representation at all, and this includes from the unions who are not part of the Labour Party. So I suppose what I'm saying is, what I feel is hopeful is here you have another movement, remembering really, I see this as as part of the inheritance of what happened with Corbyn. I remember when, you know, Corbyn for leader, and initially Momentum was a movement, and it had that energy and it had that will to change. And what we're seeing is, I think, that energy being transfigured yet again into a call which is not just about Black lives should matter. This is a response to what the establishment are doing in Euro-America. It's not just about Black Lives Matter. It's about lives mattering and people seeing lives being smashed. And that doesn't mean that what's happening with Black people is not being seen as important, but the strength is part of a resistance to the overwhelming and awful racist power of an establishment that is backing, in fact, the most reactionary forces. Because certainly as a Black person, I look at the Labour Party and what I see is that the last BAME rep for the NEC was actually chosen by the white trades unions. I mean, this is phenomenal. I see the disdain with which actually, not just from the right, but within the Labour Party itself and with many, many groups on the left, the disdain with which Black voices are actually listened to. So I suppose my query is not whether we should stay in or stay out. I think there's no doubt that Tina has it right, that we should do both, that it's not an either or, that one of the problems is for Black Lives Matter or any movement for change like that is that you have no kind of parliamentary representation. I also acknowledge the fact that what happens as soon as it becomes in a party, then it's muffled, it's muzzled. And believe you me, the issue of muscling of voices, not just Black voices, but voices within the party is a major one. I have absolutely no disagreement with that. And I also know, because I have felt this myself keenly, that for some people to remain in the Labour Party is a cruel and unusual punishment. That's what it is. It's a cruel and unusual punishment. And I have to say, when people have come to me and said, I'm thinking of suicide because of what's happened, I have told them, leave the party. If that's how you are, leave the party, because it is not worth it. But actually, there are also comrades that I know and that I know of for whom, to tell you the truth, if they're investigated, if they're suspended, if they're expelled, they don't really give a damn, or they don't really care very much. So, you know, whether you're in or you're out, I don't think that's the issue. In fact, I think we're talking about the wrong issue, whether to be in and out. I think that's a simple issue. The issue for me is where next? Where next for the left? And I think the fact that really the left has yet to grasp what Black Lives Matter is actually about, and why it has so much energy and why it has so much force behind it, shows me that actually there's a gap there, and we need to be thinking about that in a more serious matter, because at the moment, that is the resistance. Black Lives Matter is actually the resistance. Doesn't mean I'm saying it will be the only resistance or that anything will come of it, but I find it extraordinary that we're not talking more about why is it that when I go and look at a Black Lives Matter march, so many people there are white, or so many people there are young. And what's the issue of what's happening with the black resistance in London, who are actually dedicated communists, and we know nothing about them as a group. We know nothing about these left black groups. So, you know, I agree with kind of virtually lots of things that have been said. I don't see it as an easy sort of you're in or you're out. I think it's more complicated than that. I suppose in a way I look at this movement because I just don't want to be trammeled anymore with should you join this group or should you join that group or should you, you know, and that's the wonderful thing about this movement, is that they escape that. I also recognize those limitations, but I really do think it's time for the left to start looking and thinking about what's happening with this movement and thinking about why it's happening and why it's happening now in this period. And I think my signal has stayed on for the whole time that I've been speaking. So thank you very much.
Sono i confini, rosse bandiere,